what needs to be the real agenda. Thank you.
Gareth Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Kia ora, ngā mihi nui, kia koutou. Kia ora. I rise to support this important bill in the House, which is raising this important issue. I'd like to acknowledge the drafter of the bill, Jeanette Fitzsimons, and my colleague Dr Kennedy Graham, who's progressed it through the Select Committee stage. Mr. Speaker, it's disappointing we're not seeing this bill proceed through the House. Really, and I challenge some of the older members to see where we've actually seen this House think ahead, actually act proactively and legislate in advance of a problem. So often we've seen under successive governments, Mr Cosgrove, legislation responds to problems which we've seen in our community. It's reacting to problems. Here was a classic opportunity for this Parliament to think proactively, to set sustainable standards before we had a problem. Because what we know now is we're going to wait till the government uses its regulation powers after there's a problem. So it's disappointing we're not doing that. So what this bill would have done would have set sustainable standards for biofuels and future-proofed our legislation, would have given industry a leg to stand on, would have given what they crave most, which is certainty around the standards. Now, there is, of course, a serious issue of the sustainability of biofuels globally. We're seeing the last of the tropical rainforest in Southeast Asia cut down for palm oil, in part for biofuels. Of course, we're importing a great percentage of it, in fact the world's largest percentage of PKE, palm kernel expeller, for our massive dairy expansion as well. We're seeing even jatropha, marketed as a wonder biofuel, not competing with food product used by New Zealand, in fact provoke conflict in Kenya, because what we're seeing there is land which otherwise would be used for food production, used for jatropha. And it highlights the most important issue we see with biofuels globally, which is when there's a competition between the fuel tanks of the rich world and the bellies of the poor world, it's the fuel tanks of the rich world which win out in that conflict. So we acknowledge there's a serious issue globally, and we think we will see these issues in the future in New Zealand if we actually see some more biofuel used in New Zealand. Because, like Labour, we lament the low amount of biofuels we're seeing in New Zealand. This isn't a reflection of biofuels, it's a reflection of the national government's policies, their focus, their drive, which isn't prioritising biofuels at all. In fact, it's promoting drilling, mining, digging up the lignite in Southland to convert to diesel. These are their answers to the big issues. So this bill was needed. Essentially what it did is set 3 standards for sustainability. It would have asked the Minister through Order in Council to set a sustainability standard. But the principles enumerated in the bill are Principle 1, less greenhouse gas emissions. Sustainable biofuels emit significantly less greenhouse gases over their lifetime. Principle 2 is food production. Sustainable biofuels do not compete with food production or grown on land of high value for food. And thirdly and lastly, biodiversity in land with high conservation value. The production of sustainable biofuels does not reduce indigenous biodiversity or adversely affect land with high conservation value. So 1 definition of sustainable biofuels, 3 principles to guide it. And what we would have seen is some proactive, smart legislation coming out of this House, but instead in a retrograde step we're seeing the national government just vote against it, which is highly disappointing and is going to see a problem down the future which we could have remedied in 2012. The bill also reinstates the legal framework for selling biofuels in New Zealand that didn't breach the WTO obligations. It did not distinguish between imported and locally produced biofuels, but required both to meet a sustainability standard. We weren't discriminating against foreign imported biofuels, we just wanted a sustainability discrimination standard. So, Mr. Speaker, we'd like to thank the submitters who went to the committee, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, the officials at the Select Committee. The Select Committee found 4 things in their report which I'd like to address. The first was that there was no immediate concern for sustainability issues around biofuels, and they wanted to leave it up to the industry to voluntarily ensure the standards of sustainability for their fuels. Now, the national members I've heard tonight are saying, well, look, I'm sure these companies, of course, would have this paramount in their minds and not use it, but that's not what we've seen overseas, that's not what we've seen in the European Union, it's not what we've seen in America, and they provided no evidence that it's going to be any different in New Zealand if we actually saw our biofuel promotion schemes actually working. The second reason was the report of the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment. I'd like to acknowledge the amount of work that went into it, but let's not takes this report out of context. What we're talking about is a big report, and all the Commissioner said was there was no credible, cost-effective means of monitoring. It wasn't a damning report of the whole bill that meant it should have been thrown out. We could have addressed it in the Select Committee, we could have amended it. But the fact is, the main problem was, what the Parliamentary Commissioner's report highlighted was, we're going to have a double standard. We're going to have sustainable biofuels, but how on earth are we going to have sustainability standards for fossil fuels? Because what we know is this is the greatest strategic risk to our economy, but also to our planet. We know we're seeing a temperature rise of 0.8 degrees. We've got dire warnings coming out of the world's top scientists in relation to climate change. And the fact is, it highlights how unsustainable our current oil addiction is in New Zealand. So I note, when you look at this report, the one recommendation which the National Party took out of this pretty substantial report was the one recommendation that we should get rid of the bill. What about all the other recommendations that we've seen in this report? Why weren't they adopted by the government? I think it's a key question that I haven't heard any of the national members address tonight. The third issue identified in the Select Committee report was the lack of immediate biofuel take-up in New Zealand. We've heard it's less than 1%. The government scrapped Labour scheme. They budgeted $36 million towards it. What we've seen to date is less than $3 million in pickup. Now, this doesn't say much about biofuels, but it says a lot about the national government and their promotion of it. What we've seen is them delay the fuel levy, so the market signal has been skewed towards consuming more petrol and diesel in New Zealand by their decisions. And the fourth point raised in the Select Committee report was that the government already has, under the Energy, Fuel Levies and References Act, the ability to set standards through regulations on fuels, including biofuels. Now, we acknowledge that point, but the question to the government is, do they have any plan to actually enforce some standards using these regulations they have in their power? Because they're not thinking proactively. They're stuck in the drill it mindset, and all they want to see is New Zealanders keep consuming oil and gas because it lines the pockets of the few companies where they're delivering hardly any jobs, hardly any profits, hardly any taxes, because there's so many exemptions and all the profits flow offshore. So at a time when the greatest strategic risk to our economy is in fact our oil dependence, when our single greatest import is imported fossil fuels from overseas, when for every $1 US price rise in the barrel of oil, we're seeing $40 to $60 million wiped off our GDP with $1 increase, when we're seeing fuel prices now on the highest rate they've been in 4 years, this government not doing enough to promote biofuels. They're not promoting certainty in the industry by passing this bill and allowing a biofuels sustainability. But also it comes with a massive opportunity cost. Because as the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, as the Select Committee, as even Minister Brownlee identified, biofuels are a tremendous, exciting opportunity for New Zealand. The biofuels industry believe they could supply 30% of the country's transport fuel needs from biofuel, from dairy waste product, forestry product, used cooking oils, New Zealand grown canola. The Bioenergy Association believe this could be a $6 billion industry here. We're pioneering the science around cellulosic ethanol, around algae, the second generation biofuels. This is what we should be exporting overseas. But instead the government's stuck in the drill it, mine it, sell it, cut it, the only plan they've got for the economy, which is benefiting very few and actually harming our economic prospects. So we can have sustainable biofuels in New Zealand, we can be delivering cleaner fuels, we can be delivering jobs for Kiwis, we can be reducing our strategic dependence on oil, we can kick that addiction, but we're not going to do it with the current mindset of the national government. Kia ora, Mr. Speaker.
Paul Goldsmith.